The Shadow in the Mirror. Setting: the small town of Blackwood, Maine, USA. In the tiny town of Blackwood, tucked away amidst the endless pine forests of Maine, time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the past century. Narrow cobblestone streets, wooden houses with sagging roofs, and the scent of resin in the air gave the impression that nothing ever changed here. But in the fall of 1987, events began unfolding in this sleepy corner that the locals still recall in hushed tones. It all started with the mirrors. Alice Carter, a 29-year-old woman with dark hair and tired eyes, arrived in Blackwood seeking peace. Her life in Boston had shattered after a divorce. Her husband had left her for another woman, leaving her with an empty bank account and a broken heart. Working as a librarian in the big city no longer brought her joy, so she decided to start anew. Blackwood, with its silence and solitude, seemed like the perfect refuge. She found an ad in the local paper for an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town cheap, but with the condition that the new tenant wouldn't disturb certain things. The house greeted her with creaking floorboards and the smell of dampness. High ceilings, darkened wallpaper from years of neglect, and web-covered windows made it feel like an abandoned museum. The landlady, Mrs. Graves, was a frail old woman with a sharp gaze. She showed Alice around, pointing out the old fireplace, the creaky stairs, and finally pausing in front of a massive mirror in the living room. Framed in intricately carved oak, it looked like something straight out of a Gothic novel. The glass was slightly cloudy but reflected everything with unsettling clarity. "Don't stare into it too long, girl," Mrs. Graves said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't like curious eyes." Alice smiled, dismissing it as an old woman's quirk. She thanked the landlady and signed the lease, brushing off the warning. The first few days were uneventful. Alice unpacked boxes, arranged books on shelves, and adjusted to the house's sounds, the rustle of branches outside, the wind whistling through the chimney. But soon, she began to notice oddities. Every time she passed the mirror, a faint chill ran down her spine, as if someone were breathing on the back of her neck. One evening, while pouring tea in the kitchen, she glanced into the living room through the open door. The mirror reflected her figure, but Alice froze. She was holding a teapot, yet her reflection stood still, hands empty, staring straight at her. She blinked, and the reflection snapped back to normal. "Just my imagination," she told herself, though her heart raced. The next day, the strangeness intensified. While brushing her hair in front of the small bathroom mirror, she noticed a large mirror in the living room reflecting something else in not the room, but a dark, blurry space with shifting shadows. Alice approached it, squinting to make out details, but the longer she looked, the dizzier she felt. Suddenly, her reflection smiled slowly, menacingly, while her own face remained serious. She stumbled back, nearly falling. "It's just fatigue," she muttered, but her voice shook. Deep down, she knew something was wrong. She decided to get rid of the mirror. Armed with a hammer, Alice tried to pry it off the wall, but it wouldn't budge. The frame seemed fused to the plaster, and the glass didn't scratch or crack, no matter how hard she struck. She then tried painting it black, but the paint slid off, refusing to stick. The mirror stayed pristine, as if mocking her efforts. Alice began searching for answers. At the local library, where she'd taken a part-time job, she dug through old archives. Among yellowed newspapers and dusty books, she found an article from 1893 titled "Tragedy in Blackwood. Fire Claims the Winthrop Family." It described how the house she now lived in had burned to the ground in a mysterious blaze. The owner, Thomas Winthrop, was a wealthy but reclusive eccentric obsessed with the occult. Rumor had it he commissioned the mirror from a European craftsman, claiming it would let him peer beyond the veil. On the night of the fire, he was found dead in front of it, his face twisted in terror. Strangely, the mirror survived the flames unscathed, while everything else turned to ash. The more Alice learned, the worse life in the house became. At night, she heard whispers a low, guttural voice calling her name. A lice. A lice. Sometimes the mirror showed dark silhouettes gliding across its surface, though the room was empty. One night she awoke to footsteps on the stairs. Opening her eyes, she saw her own reflection standing by her bed. It looked real pale skin, hollow eyes, and a cold hand brushing her shoulder. Alice screamed and flicked on the light, but the room was empty. Downstairs, the mirror hummed faintly, as if alive. Desperate, she sought out John Hayes, a local old man known for his knowledge of legends. John lived in a small cabin outside town, surrounded by rusty traps and bundles of dried herbs. His weathered face resembled an ancient map, and his eyes gleamed with the weight of too many secrets. That mirror's no ordinary thing, he said, puffing on his pipe. Winthrop wanted to open a window to another world. They say he found an old ritual in a book he bought from a traveling merchant. But he didn't account for one thing. Windows work both ways. Something came through and took him. Now it's hungry. It wants you. How do I destroy it? Alice asked, her voice trembling. John fell silent for a long moment before handing her a brittle sheet of paper inscribed with Latin text. You can only break it from the inside, he said. But be careful. Time moves differently beyond the veil, and not everything you see there will be true. Alice returned home with an axe and the paper in hand. Standing before the mirror, she felt the air thicken. As she read the text aloud, the glass trembled and her reflection distorted. Her voice grew louder, the words echoing off the walls. Suddenly, the mirror flared with black light and Alice was pulled inside. She found herself in a dark, frigid place. The air was thick as tar, filled with rustling sounds and distant screams. A figure emerged, a hunched man in an old-fashioned coat. His face was ravaged, his eye sockets empty, but his voice was clear. You've come to me, Alice. Now you'll stay. It was Thomas Winthrop, what was left of him. He stepped closer, and behind him, other shadows appeared twisted, silent forms with outstretched hands. Alice gripped the axe. Her heart pounded, but she refused to give up. She lunged at the mirror hanging in this strange realm, a portal back to her world. One strike and the glass cracked. The shadows shrieked. Winthrop reached for her, but she swung again. A deafening shatter rang out, and the world exploded into fragments. Alice awoke on the living room floor, drenched in sweat. The mirror lay in tiny pieces, and the room smelled of smoke. She gasped for air, but for the first time in weeks, she felt relief. The next day, she packed her things and left Blackwood, abandoning the house to its solitude. Years later, a new legend took root in the town. People claimed that a shadow of a woman with an axe in hand sometimes appeared in the old house's windows, staring into the void. Children whispered that it was Alice, still guarding the town from whatever lurked beyond the veil. And the mirror's shards, never cleared away, occasionally glinted in the grass, reflecting not the sky, but something dark, endless, and hungry.